I am so happy to be able to introduce to you one of my first authors for Plant Hills Publishing, Emil Cicogna. Emil, I don't know if you know this, but you are officially author number 4 in the Flint Hills Publishing catalog. And now we have over 30. So you have been there with me since the beginning. And you entrusted yourself to a pretty green publisher from the prairie of Kansas, but I just felt such an instant connection with you. It's just been an honor and a real pleasure to work with you. But I do have to say that when we first met at that Starbucks, you kind of kept it a little quiet how many books you actually had in your drawer at home. But it's been a thrill to see all the work that you have done for so many decades, and now we can turn it into books and get it into the world. So thanks for being here today, Emil.
Thank you, Thea. I can't explain how I knew I could work with you on a phone call and a cup of coffee. I don't know how, but I knew I could work with you, and I've never looked back, and I will never regret that decision. That I can assure you.
Well, I knew that there was some kind of perhaps cosmic clue that we were meant to be together, because it's not that often that I run into a man who grew up in New York City, who moved to the desert, who absolutely adores the Wizard of Oz. So I knew that you had some depth there, that it's going to all work out great. So, well, Emil, when did you know that you were a writer, or that you wanted to be a writer?
I can tell you I've thought about it literally since I'm a little child. I have something from third grade here at home where I was 8 years old, and the teacher asked everybody, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And believe it or not, in third grade at 8 years old, I said, "I want to be a writer when I grow up."
Hmm.
And I think it came from my family really being big on reading and always having a lot of books around. Believe it or not, when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, I received birthday and Christmas presents of books, sets of books to read. I read, the Jack London books, the Herman Hesse books, the Rudyard Kipling books. I mean, this is what my family encouraged, and no one ever had to push a book at me. I really loved reading. Maybe it was just my little escape, and I was, a kid, and I was home, and I just enjoyed reading so much that eventually it turned into, I really want to write a good story, something that not only tells a good story, but you can really learn from, because I've learned so much from reading literature. I'll just name one of my favorite authors, Jack London, who wrote some terrific stories, sometimes violent and yet so heartfelt, and the lessons about life that you can learn reading Edgar Allan Poe, even the way he could look at people and know what was going on, that always fascinated me. So it started early.
Well, one of the things that has always struck me about you, Emil, is that you are very passionate about many things. You're passionate about your family, your marriage, and your career, which has not, you're pretty new to being a published author, relatively speaking, given your career. So tell us about where you put your passion with your career.
Well, my career has been teaching for 35 years, which is hard to even believe as I'm saying it. I started teaching in the New York City public school system in 1987 in a middle school in the Bronx. And I worked as a teacher in the Bronx for 15 years, mostly at high school level. The first year or two was middle school as a substitute, which was a challenging job. But I am passionate about teaching because as I've seen, the public school system evolve, I get really worked up about it sometimes, because teachers are such a dedicated group of people, and you either love teaching or you don't. And the people who love it, we can look at each other and say, no one understands what we do or why we do it, but we do it anyway. And that's just how it is. And sure enough, I was able to incorporate some of that into this trilogy that I guess we'll talk about in a minute. The Sign of the Times trilogy has two main characters, both women, who are teachers. And I put, a lot of my own thoughts about classrooms and teaching, but more dealing with children, which is, I think, a very special gift some people have, and some people don't, and that's just human nature.
Mhm.
And if you don't have that gift, that's fine. You can be very successful. Just don't get in a classroom with children.
I told you he's passionate. And now you are moved to the point in your career where you are actually educating educators,
Yes, I am.
right?
Yes,
Right.
I
Uh-huh.
work with student
Mhm.
teachers and people in the education track to get a teaching degree and a teaching license at Grand
Mhm.
Canyon University here in Phoenix. And working with these young people who want to get in the classroom and really teach reading is what my area is. Teach reading to kids who don't read well. I did
Mhm.
that for many years, and now seeing these young people that they are so passionate. You talk about me being passionate. They want to get in that classroom and work with these kids and teach them the, phonics and all these reading things that if they even impart half of what they know to some of these kids, those kids have benefited so much. And it
Mm.
is it does me good to work with these young teachers because I really feel no matter what we see on the television or on the news, a lot of our students are entrusted to some very good people, and I'm happy about that.
Hmm. Well, Emil, when we first met, I was so intrigued. You did a fantastic job pitching your book to a publisher. You told me the origin story of the trilogy, A Sign of the Times, um, and how you had used that as a vehicle to inspire kids that I think you told me had never even read a complete book before, and these were high school kids.
Yes,
And so tell me, tell us a little bit about that, because that's
yes.
just so fascinating to me how it got started.
I will give just a little bit of backstory of how I even wrote this book. And yes, I ended up reading it it was a 10th grade class with my students. But what had happened was I had learned about my family history when I was still living in New York, and my own children, my two boys, were very small, and my father's father was a blacksmith, and that ended up being the main character of the story, A Sign of the Times. The man is a blacksmith, and the story takes place in 1885. And I was intrigued by these tools that my father always had boxes of tools in our house. And he had one that was this little wooden handmade box. I had no idea what the tools were. I mean, I knew my tools pretty well. I grew up with a family of, carpenters and construction people, but I didn't know what these tools were for. And with my family, my wife and my two kids, we went to Colonial Williamsburg, which is several hours from where we lived in New York, but we drove down there. But what I realized, besides all the history that, as you know, I love, the whole idea of history through literature, uh, we ended up going to Busch Gardens. And for anyone who wants to know, Busch Gardens has the Clydesdale barn, which those beautiful Clydesdale horses, we are to see them go into the stable and everything. But then as you get through there, there's a museum display in the lobby. And what's in this glass case? The tools that were in my grandfather's toolbox. And it just struck me in such a strong way. I said right then and there, I have to write a book about this. I have to write a book with a character who's a blacksmith. Somehow I had to come up with this. And it took me a few years, and then I did. As you mentioned before, I put the other book that I had written in the desk drawer, and now I was writing this one, and it ended up going in the desk drawer for a number of years also.
Mhm.
When I was in the high school here in Phoenix, yes, I had every term they give me what they called a reading class with students who were about 16 years old, and they really were maybe reading on fourth or fifth grade level.
Mhm.
And that was my job. Basically, I had three directives in that classroom. There's only 15 kids in there. A lot of them were behavior or attendance issue kids, and they said keep them in the room, keep them in their seats, and get them to read something. Get them to read. And I just started with the textbook. None of them could read it. And I just found materials, going down the line, 10th grade, ninth grade, eighth grade, seventh grade, trying to find something they could read. And they weren't really into it. And one day I was just kind of musing and there was a student who sat right in front of me, this young man who was such an insightful little guy. And but it was an inclusion class. He had an IEP. And I know
Mhm.
for a fact that IEP came from the fact that he was limited English, not that he couldn't learn. And I remember one day we were talking about this animated movie that Rapunzel was the character with the long hair. And I couldn't remember the name. I said, the Rapunzel up in the tower. I think the name of the movie is Twisted. And he just laughed and he goes, "Do you mean Tangled?" And he was a smart little guy. And when I said, "Yeah, well, I wrote something. Maybe you guys want to read that. You can't read anything. You don't want to read anything." I did, and he looked up at me and he said, "You wrote it?" I says, "Yes, I did." He says, "I'll read it." And as soon as he said that, the hands went up. The kids, "I'll read it, I'll read it, I'll read it."
Mhm.
And yes, I brought it from home. I printed it out on my printer, put it in the copy machine without permission, and handed it out to the students. It was this thick, with a clip. And I am so proud to be able to tell this part of the story that here, kids with attendance issues, kids who came in late every day, for 2.5 weeks, every student was there every day on time. This one guy, I couldn't believe he was there. He came running in, "Give me my book, give me my book," because he wanted to read
Mm.
my book.
Mm.
And they did. They read it start to finish. And one kid who, again, these were students who, as you mentioned, they never read them. Many of them told me, "I've never read the whole book, start to finish."
Mm.
And this one student looks at me and he said, when we were near the end, we were close to the end of the story, and the name of the book is A Sign of the Times. So it's not an obvious title of what this book is actually about. And he goes, "I know what the title means. I looked at the end." And as a teacher, you're like, you previewed the end of the story, like things that I could only dream that these kids would do in my classroom. Uh,
Mm.
I made that connection with them. They read the book. They got a lot out of it. They did learn some history. That's the whole premise,
Mhm.
history through literature. And after that, I was just hooked. I said, I have got to get this book published. I have got to find a way to use it with students. And then as it evolved, once I started working with you, Thea,
Mm.
I also did a study guide for that book.
Right.
The teachers
Right.
to teach this book, not just read it, which is a good exercise in itself, but teach history through literature. And it's now evolved into a trilogy with 3 study guides that
Mhm.
I'm just thrilled that we got to do all 3 of them.
Well, so the Sign of the Times is the first book in the trilogy, and then the next book is Rachel. I have to say, she's my favorite character. I've never admitted that to you. And there, like you said, there's a study guide for that. And then the final book in the trilogy, The Hammer and the Anvil, which also has the study guide, will be available hopefully in definitely in February of 2024. It's coming out
Right.
real. We're just tweaking the very end here, and I know I'm going to feel a great sense of completion and accomplishment on your behalf, Emil. It's been a huge undertaking, and I love the overarching, storyline and how you develop all these characters. And I have to say, in book 3, tell us what the timeline is there, because I learned a lot of history from you
Yeah.
in book 3.
Yeah, thank you. Book 3 starts about near the second half of 1919. So it's the aftermath of World War One, which I don't think many people today can really grasp the magnitude of that event. And even for people living in the United States, we sent a couple of 100,000 soldiers over to Europe and lost over 100,000 lives in World War One, and it was just a bloodbath over there. Which right off the bat, I had no idea the numbers of people, primarily from Pennsylvania and many from New York. And the book goes from late in 1919 to early in 1924. So we are in that decade nicknamed the Roaring Twenties. And so here, 1919, they're talking about, oh, in a few months, in January of 1920, we're going to get prohibition. It was illegal to drink. And yet the Roaring Twenties are almost stereotyped by everybody going to speakeasies and drinking and dancing, and the women with the flapper clothes. It just became this really, wild decade when we were supposed to be in a time when drinking was illegal. There's such a paradox in this country, and that's part of our history. That, here we send all these men, mostly men, not only men, to Europe to try and bring peace to the world and show that we can be good people in a good country. And then at the same time, we have this alter ego, this personality that wants to show that we know how to tear loose and have a good time because this is America. We can do that. And I just love that about my own research. I learned so much about the Roaring Twenties, and what really comes out of it, and it was a perfect vehicle for telling the story, was this family is involved in working at the town newspaper. And it allows me to throw a lot of events into there that they're just discussing it because they're going to put it in the paper. And that's where everybody got their information in the 20s. It became the internet of 100 years ago. It really did.
Mhm.
And just like you can, order anything you want on Amazon these days or on the internet, you used to open the newspaper, see a product, let's say a potbelly stove that you wanted one for your house, and you could literally mail order it. Big companies like Sears and Montgomery Ward were already doing mail order. You could get anything from razor blades to anything you wanted. And it has not really changed all that much, except now we have computers instead of newspapers. It's only the vehicle that's changed. Our lifestyles haven't
Mhm.
changed as much as we think. And
Emil, you're good at sneaking in a lot of historical information. And in Rachel, the second book, as I mentioned, I love the character Rachel, who is a teacher. You talk a lot, or you incorporate a lot of information into the storyline about women obtaining the right to vote. And I think that's something very important that young people, really understand, that we can touch back not that far in history, that my grandmother was born at a time when her mother and she did not have the right to vote. So I commend you for making that one of the plot lines. I think that's very informative and important information.
thank you. Yeah, well, that becomes a big part of the third book, The Hammer and the Anvil. In addition to the other events taking place, it's a big moment for Rachel, who you mentioned, going and finally voting for the first time in her life and voting in a presidential election, no less. And it's a very big deal. And there are, storylines within the book Hammer and the Anvil where the women's vote decided a lot of elections at that time that some of the politicians weren't really counting on.
Mm.
It was not a traditional thing. They had no history about it, how women might vote. And what happened in Pennsylvania, as anyone who reads the book will find out, a man named Gifford Pinchot won the election twice for governor. And he was married to a woman who was a staunch advocate for women's rights. And when the papers started making it known that this man had, yes, his political ideas, but his wife was a women's right advocate, the women's vote definitely influenced, if not decided, the governor's election in Pennsylvania, not once, but twice. And I had never even heard of this man. I don't mind, admitting that. But doing the research for this book, yeah, the women's vote became a real force in this country. And I think a lot of kids, today just take it for granted. And
Mhm.
those of us who know from like family members who could not even go and vote,
Mhm.
uh, it's not something to be taken for granted.
Mhm. But I don't want to give people the impression that this is just, kind of a dry history book. I mean, a lot of action goes on. I was teasing you about I don't like stories where things happen to babies. I mean, there is a lot of compelling drama in the books as well. And I really commend you on that. How you conclude the series was a little shocking to me. But it's a page turner. It's a teaching history through literature is your mantra. And you do that and you teach it in a way that is extremely entertaining. And this book isn't I'm not necessarily the target audience for this book. What ages would you say that you see reading this?
I would say either from kids who are on grade level in middle school. The first book, A Sign of the Times, is definitely the easiest of the three books to read. But there was a little bit of planning that went into that, which is try to get the kids involved, get them involved with the story and the characters. It's definitely the shortest of the three books. The Sign of the Times is a little easier on the historical fact and some of the family issues. But then once you get into Rachel, which is almost not quite, but almost twice as long, and you get into her life as an adult. In the first book, Rachel is a little child; she's 5, but the second book jumps 16 years ahead and is now in 1901 or 1902 when it begins. And then the third book is only a few months after Rachel ends. It just continues, really. And someone recently asked me that. They said, are the same characters in all three books? And I was a little surprised at that question, but it just shows the characters who are children at the beginning or in the early stages of, let's say, Rachel. By the time you get into the Hammer and the Anvil, they're adults. And that's what happens in all families. The children grow up. They assume adult roles. New children are born. Older people pass on. It's how it is in every family in the whole world. And that is reflected in this story. It covers from the first book, the first page, to the end, almost 40 years. I think it's 39 years is the timeline. And it's, if any of us look at 30 years ago, it's like, wow, that was then. That they were still here. Look how young they look in a picture. We all go through that. And that's the realism I was looking for. A lot of our students go home and they're playing video games. They're watching Harry Potter, who can wave a magic wand when he has issues. And Spider-Man can do all kinds of things. I always have said when talking about teaching history through literature, our kids could use a dose of reality once in a while and be reminded that when they turn that TV off or turn that video game off, they have a family to deal with. They have school to do. They have teachers to work with. They have this reality that some of them would rather not think about. But these books at least give them a chance to know that, like one of the characters mentions in the first book, he knows his parents both love him, but they just have very different ways of showing it. And I think a lot of kids will go, wow, yeah, really, and to be able to make that connection for kids, I think is an important thing to do.
Well, Emil, I've loved working with you on this series, but this is not the only series or the only books you have published with Flint Hills Publishing. We also have 2 other novels that are quite different, Going Long and All for One. And I think you have kind of hinted to there's another book or 2 in the drawer, but I look forward to that. And all of Emil's books can be found on his website, emilcicogna.com, and then also on Flint Hills Publishing. You can buy the books on Amazon, wherever books are sold. And Emil, I thank you for being here today and sharing your passion with us. It's just an honor for me to get to publish your work. Thank you so much for all you've done, to help so many children improve their lives and learn to love books. I love that.
Thank you. Great talking with you, Thea. I appreciate it.
Take care.